Okay, so I think we're just about ready to get started. So welcome everyone to this month's seminar of the IAU Working Group on Active B stars. My name is Alex David Uraz, and it's my pleasure to present Professor Sally Ooi, from the University of Michigan. So Professor Ooi started out at Bryn Mawr College before then getting a PhD at the University of Arizona, and has since occupied positions at the University of Cambridge, Space Telescope Science Institute, Low Observatory, before ending up at University of Michigan, where she's a full professor today. And Dr. Ooi will be talking to us about OBE star kinematics, evidence supporting binary interactions. So without further ado, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to present. And I want to start by acknowledging the members of my research group, first of all, who have contributed to this work, my undergraduate students over here. And can you see my cursor okay? You'll let me know if you don't. And then the graduate students over here and my other collaborators who have contributed to this work on the right-hand side, including quite a few other people who deserve to be mentioned but can't be fit on as well. So I don't need to explain to this group, of course, that OBE stars are stars that are spinning so rapidly that they have produced a decretion disk. And so the question is, of course, how did they end up spinning so fast? And I think in recent years, the evidence has been building that they have acquired that very fast spin through binary interactions. And so I want to share an adorable animation that was made by Ylva Hjortberg that some of you may already have seen before that illustrates how this works. So you have a binary pair, and the more massive star, presumably, will start to evolve slightly. And as it begins to evolve, it will start swelling up. And as it does so, it will fill its Roche lobe, and that will allow mass transfer to occur. And it will start transferring not just mass, but also angular momentum. And therefore, the mass gainer will begin to spin very rapidly in addition to gaining mass. And so in that case, you end up with, you end up with a stripped star, which was the mass donor, and a fast rotator. And the fast rotator could very likely, therefore, be an OBE star. And now we are really appreciating the importance of binary interactions in the evolution of massive stars. Indeed, we pretty much accept that all massive stars form as binaries, and that over 70% of them, and some of the more recent studies are suggesting even more than 90% of these OB stars actually end up being mass transfer binaries at some point during their lifetimes. This effect is even more pronounced at low metallicity. So the scenario is looking like these classical OBE stars are most likely the result of post-interaction binaries. And there's quite a bit of evidence that is starting to build up now in favor of that scenario. We're seeing that binary companions of classical OBE stars tend to be most post-main sequence objects. The statistics and properties of the OBE stars are also consistent with binary population synthesis models. We also see that statistics of these objects in clusters and outside of clusters are also consistent with such an idea. And many of these OBE stars also show truncated disks, which are evidence of a binary companion, whether compact or not compact. So what else can we look at to further support or not this model? Well, if they are interacting binaries, then that means that they have been very close binaries, and eventually that mass donor is going to explode as a supernova. Therefore, once you have the supernova going off, that means that the mass gainer, which is presumably the OBE star, it will acquire a runaway velocity, or in any case, it will be accelerated so that it could be ejected from its cluster. So on average, we would expect such stars, the OBE stars, to be accelerated stars and therefore being found more frequently in the field. Now, there are two ways of creating runaway stars. One of them is the supernova ejection mechanism. The other is a dynamical ejection mechanism, so that when you have a lot of stars in clusters and in very dense clusters in the centers of these, the massive stars gravitate toward the middle and they undergo these dynamical interactions, which then also eject stars. This can result not just in the ejection of single stars, but also in the ejection of binary pairs, as you just saw there. And these binary pairs that get ejected are also very tight objects. You can see that again going off to the lower right there. So we know that runaway stars exist. We know there are a lot of stars in the field that are also massive stars. And we know that the frequency of O stars that are runaways is higher than the frequency of B stars. And as mentioned, the origin of these objects are either dynamical ejections or supernova ejections, both of which involve at least binaries. And in the case of dynamical ejections, can also result from multiple body interactions. So let's consider OBe stars as possible results of binary interactions, and therefore, as mentioned, objects that should more favorably be found in the field of galaxies. So our group has been studying the Small Magellanic Cloud for many years. And what I'm showing here is an H-alpha map of the SMC where you can see the clusters more clearly. That's the grayscale. And then overplotted in the colored points are the data of OB stars that have been uniformly selected from the catalog of Massey 2002. This is from our very old work, which I shall call the OKP sample. So these are not necessarily the fully complete population of OB stars, but they have been uniformly selected and represent maybe half of the O and B stars in the SMC. And so that's the OKP sample, and it's complete down to 15.2 magnitudes in B. And if you look at these, you can start getting a sense that the OBe stars, which are shown in red, are more dispersed than the OB stars, which are in blue. You especially get that sense if you start looking toward the outskirts of the galaxy, where you can see the outskirts tend to be more dominated by those redder points, which are the OBe stars. So we can quantify this impression by looking at the distances that these stars are from what we want, ideally, is the clusters. But since we don't have, well, one method that was introduced for doing this was done by Smith and Tumbleson for LBV stars, but using O stars as a proxy for clusters. So the O stars travel the least. One can kind of say, okay, well then O stars are generally found in clusters. So what are the distances of individual stars of any given population from the nearest O stars? And that should give you an idea of how far on average the population is dispersed into the field. So for example, if we consider O stars, other O stars should be closer to them than, for example, B stars. And so what I'm showing here are cumulative distribution functions for the distances of any given population stars to their nearest O stars, which is shown on the x-axis. So the top x-axis gives you the distance in parsecs. The lower x-axis gives you the distance in degrees. So if we look at the early O stars, which are shown in blue, we can see that the distances of early O stars to other O stars is less than for other populations. This line is at the lowest median values on the x-axis, which correspond to, if we look at this, the median is 50%, which is right around here. So it's about 19 parsecs. Let's compare that now to B stars, normal B stars, which are the red line over here in the middle, the solid red line. So we can see that B stars on average are more dispersed. They are farther away from the nearest O star than what we saw for early O stars. So the median value for B stars, and these are early B stars from the OKP sample, no later than say B1 or B0.5, something like that. So these B stars have a median value of about 30 parsecs. So now let's compare that to the distribution functions for the OE and BE stars. So the OE stars are shown by the purple dotted lines, and the BE stars are shown by the dotted red lines. So the OE stars are this function right here, this curve. And then the B stars are this curve right here. And so we can see that for both the OE stars and the BE stars, that they are farther out into the field than what we see for either normal O stars or normal B stars, which are the solid lines. And we can quantify that by looking at the Mann-Whitney statistic, which looks at the difference in position of the curve. And we confirm that for late O is the purple line over here, the purple solid line, late O versus OE stars, the statistic is less than 0.1. For normal B stars versus BE stars, the statistic is even lower. So confirming very strongly that these are not the same distributions, at least in position along the x-axis. Similarly, one can look at the high mass X-ray binaries, which are the yellow curve. We know that high mass X-ray binaries indisputably are post-supernova binary systems that originated from massive stars. And so if the OE-BE stars are a similar type of phenomenon, then we would expect their cumulative distribution function to also be similar to that. Whoops, I backed up a little bit early. Sure enough, we see that the OBE and stars, the OE and BE stars, do seem to approach the distribution function for the high mass X-ray binaries. When we compare the Mann-Whitney statistic for OE stars versus high mass X-ray binaries and BE stars versus high mass X-ray binaries, they both give values of 0.28. It's not as strong of a signal as what we saw for the normal OB stars versus OE-BE stars, but you can see that it is an interesting number in any case, and the high mass X-ray binaries have a median value that is slightly higher than what we see for OBE stars. Now, one issue that has been brought up in the literature regarding this method is completeness of samples and biases in the samples. So the spectral types that we used for this analysis were obtained from the literature and primarily from these surveys, the Massey 2002, Evans surveys, and the Lamb survey. The Lamb survey is our survey of field stars. And so, as mentioned, we pretty much have a complete spectroscopic sample of all the field stars in this OKP sample that's being shown here. So the field is highly complete, whereas cluster stars, as you know, there are not fully complete samples of the spectral types obtained through spectroscopic classifications of cluster stars. That is a vast undertaking. And so there's a lot of incompleteness in the cluster stars. Let's take a look at what that does to these plots. And before I turn the page, I just want to also mention that the OBE stars were obtained from primarily these catalogs over here. Again, these are from the literature. The OBE stars are highly complete because these catalogs go down to at least 18th magnitude in the continuum, which is deeper than generally what one finds for the OB stars. So let's look at the selection effect for the spectral types. Basically, what we're looking at is that the group stars do not have as much complete spectral type information. We tried to take that into account by allowing for candidate O stars and candidate B stars in these samples of early, late, and etc. B stars. So if a star could be considered a candidate O star, then we constructed a cumulative distribution function that allowed for that, and a separate one that didn't allow for that. This is maybe easier to see back here again. So the one that allows all the candidates is the one on the right here. It's the one that's to the, that if you look at this shaded region, it's the right border of the shaded region. The one that allows only, I'm sorry, it's the other way around. The one that allows all the candidates is the one on the left, and the one that allows only confirmed spectral types is the right-hand side distribution. So between these is the median, which is the value that we're adopting. So that allows a complete uncertainty between objects that may or may not have been considered members of that particular population versus knowing objects that we know for sure are members of that population. So this shaded region allows for that uncertainty in the membership of the population itself. But let's take a look at these plots. So if we allow only stars with confirmed spectral classifications to serve as the quote unquote home base stars from which for O stars. So you recall that these cumulative distribution functions measure the distance of populations to the nearest O stars. If those O star samples are themselves incomplete, this is an example of what happens. So if we look at only those populations with confirmed spectral types to serve as the home base stars, then you get this plot over here. And you can see that it has skewed considerably, in particular at the lower end. And that's because many of the group stars have been eliminated from the sample because, as mentioned, the group stars are the ones that are incomplete with respect to spectral typing of O stars. The field stars are ones where we are very complete, having obtained spectral types of essentially all the field stars. So if we are uncertain about how many group O stars there are, we've dropped a whole bunch of groups from the sample, and therefore this spreads out at the lower end, which is the smallest values in distances toward the left side of the plot. And you can confirm that by looking at the right-hand plot, where here we allow the home base stars to be only the field stars. So if you're looking only at field stars, then the distance to the nearest field star is always going to be essentially the field star distance. So all of the distribution functions therefore end up being the same, and this plots only the distribution function of field stars essentially. So the field is maximized in the upper right. You can see in the left-hand plot that they are converging toward that value, but that for the clusters, the lower left is not converging. So the fact that we can see how these biases behave allows us to better understand what we're looking at here. And the fact that they are converging toward the clusters in the lower left and converging toward the field in the upper right lends confidence, therefore, that there isn't a significant systematic bias introduced by these kinds of effects in this plot. So the fact that these lines, for example, are mostly parallel to each other is further confirmation of that effect. So I'm afraid that's a little bit complicated, but this issue has been discussed substantially in the literature, so I did want to mention it. Essentially, what the bottom line is there, in order to find that there are more OBe stars in the field, does that mean that we are systematically biasing against the discovery of OBe stars in clusters? The answer to that is basically no. And we also discussed in our paper, this is work by my undergraduate, Matt Dallas, we also discussed in our paper looking at the clusters. There's been work on NGC 330, for example, and 346 by Bodensteiner, and comparing to Evans' catalog work on these clusters. And in general, it's easier to find OBe stars in clusters than normal OB stars. And that's because OBe stars have this very strong H-alpha emission that's very easy to spot. They also are slightly older, which means that they tend not to be in the very cores of the clusters and so forth. So you may also say, okay, well, let's look at the masses. It could be, for example, that OBe stars tend to prefer slightly lower mass stars, and that maybe that's what's going on here. So we did convert the data that we have to the masses. This introduces additional systematic errors that are model dependent. So I'm not as keen on this comparison because it's not looking at the direct observables, but nonetheless, we can do this. And we're now looking in the blue here at stars that are greater than 30 solar masses. The red is stars less than 20 solar masses. And again, the OB stars are shown in solid lines. The OBe stars are shown in dotted lines. And you can see that the same trends exist. The high mass X-ray binaries, once again, in yellow for comparison. So the dotted lines, the OBE stars, again, the furthest out into the field and approaching the distribution function for the high mass X-ray binaries. One other thing that's interesting about this is that the distribution functions for the OE stars in purple and the B stars in red are very, very similar, as you can see, to each other. And that is also consistent with the idea that mass transfer has occurred, because it suggests that the stars have forgotten what their original masses were. And so again, if you have mass transfer, then that effect can get smeared out, the mass effect. So we are seeing that OBE stars tend to be more isolated than OB stars. Their distribution into the field seems to be similar to that of the high mass X-ray binaries, and the OE distributions and BE distributions seem to be similar to each other. And all of this is consistent with the idea that mass transfer has occurred and that these objects are post-supernova objects. So if that is the case, then can we actually look at the proper motions of these objects? And the answer is yes, we can look at the proper motions of these objects. And we're looking in particular at the field sample. Once again, these are the easiest to obtain proper motions for with Gaia. Let me introduce you to the sample. This is the Runaways and Isolated O-type Stars Spectroscopic Survey of the SMC, or RIOTS-4, which was the PhD thesis of my student Joel Lamb back in 2016. These are a subsample of the OKP sample, which, as mentioned, is photometrically selected. So these are field stars that are at least 28 parsecs away from any other object in the sample, yielding about 374 stars. And we did obtain spectroscopic confirmation of that all of these, for the most part, are OB stars, including OBE stars. So with all of our spectra that we obtained at Magellan, we did a lot of science with all of this. We obtained the mass functions, the radial velocities, V sin I. We identified an interesting class of weak-lined supergiant B bracket E stars, obtained some double-line spectroscopic binaries, and as I shall show, a whole bunch of OE stars, and looked at the possibility that any of these may have formed in the field as isolated star formation, and obtaining now the proper motions of these objects. So let me first convince you that these stars are in fact all ejected from clusters. It turns out that only about 5% of these objects are likely to have formed in situ as isolated star formation in the field. And it's possible, in fact, that none of them formed that way, that they're all objects ejected from clusters. So I'm showing here some work from my graduate student, Irene Vargas Salazar. And what she did was she searched around all of these target OB stars to see if there was any evidence of tiny clusters to show that these stars may have formed in situ as relatively isolated star formation events. This right here is one of the few examples where it's relatively obvious that that may be the case. The vast majority of these actually look very isolated. And so what she did in this particular example, and she used a few different methods to look at the stellar densities around these stars. But here, for example, what she's doing is calculating the so-called M parameter, which is looking at the stellar density of the field, looking at all stars now, not just the massive stars, and saying, what is the average separation that you have between these field background stars? And that is what's in the numerator here. And then looking with a friends of friends algorithm to identify stars that seem to be associated with the star, the target star in the middle. So what is the mean distance of those friends of friends identified objects? And that goes into the numerator. So the smaller the distances we have here, that means that the larger the M value becomes. And one can also amplify the signal from that by multiplying times the number of friends of friends stars that have been identified by the algorithm. So this plot that's shown here is a histogram. It's showing the distribution of the M values that she's calculated for one of the samples. And that's shown in the hashed histogram. And then in the colored plots, she's showing random field simulations for each field that contains one of the target stars. And so you can see that the data actually do show a slight enhancement, apparently visually, compared to these random simulations. And again, she can calculate the significance of that using different statistical tests. The Wilcoxon test suggests that indeed these are real, the p-values are tiny, but one would also expect the tail of this distribution to extend further out if this is a real signal. And so the Rosenbaum test is a test that looks at the tails, and that actually is not giving a significant signal. So she ran a few other types of methods to look at the stellar densities and statistical tests. And so we're getting kind of, some tests suggest that there is a signal, some tests suggest that there aren't. It does look quite likely that there are a very few objects that are formed in situ, but they are certainly no more than 5%. And these objects in themselves are very, very interesting, clearly, in terms of the possibility of isolated star formation. But for the most part, one can take away from this that essentially all field stars, the vast majority of them, are indeed ejected from clusters. So here are examples of our spectra of OBe stars. These are all OE stars from our sample, from the work of Jesse Golden Marks back in 2016. You can see the Balmer emission line here, and H beta and H gamma. These are all O stars, as you can see from the helium-2 absorption lines that are present in all of these. And some of them are very early type. So here we're looking at O5.5 to 6. We can look at the distribution and spectral types of them here. And don't worry too much about the different colors, but you can see what the distribution looks like. And indeed, we find stars that are even earlier than O6, but they're very hard to classify because once you get to those early types, the helium-1 lines also start going into emission, which makes it difficult to classify them. We found 9 stars that are earlier than O7.5. And the earliest OE star in the Milky Way is O7.5. So that is interesting when one looks at the low metallicity of the SMC. And we found 29 OE stars altogether, which represent more than a quarter of all the field O stars in the SMC. Again, a much higher frequency than what one finds in the Milky Way, and no doubt linked to the SMC's metallicity. So here are V sin I's for at least the B stars. We can look at non-BE stars in the top plot and then BE stars in the lower plot, confirming that the BE stars are indeed fast rotators. And we also see a component of fast rotators among the normal B stars in the upper plot. So it would be interesting to speculate that these objects are similar in origin to the BE stars that we see. And the OE stars are similar, but of course, smaller statistics. So here are the Gaia velocities that we're looking at. Recall that the ejection mechanisms, there's 2 different ones, the dynamical and the supernova mechanism. For the dynamical mechanism, one expects them to be somewhat faster, more massive stars because one can leverage the gravitational potential energy from multiple stars in the dynamical mechanism. And you recall that the massive stars gravitate toward the center of the clusters and indeed may have formed there through mass segregation at the time of formation. So we expect faster, more massive stars through the dynamical ejection mechanism when compared to the supernova ejection mechanism. We obtained Gaia proper motions for the whole Riots for Fields sample, and these were originally published by my undergraduate, Johnny Dorigo Jones, in 2020 using the DR2 data. And my current undergraduate, Grant Phillips, is now reanalyzing these using the DR3 data, and we are finding some significant differences. So with the DR3, we have 341 of the Riots 4 stars, which is a 10% increase compared to what we had in total numbers compared to what we had in the 2020 work. These proper motions are all calculated relative to their local velocity fields for all of the Gaia stars detectable brighter than Gaia magnitude of 18. And these are fields within 90 parsecs or 5 arc minutes of the target star. This is just a visual impression of what you have here. The OBe stars, again, shown in red, and then the normal OB stars in blue. And then we're also showing a few other populations, the high mass X-ray binaries in yellow, and double-line spectroscopic binaries and eclipsing binaries in green. So let's look at some velocity distributions. First of all, comparing the DR2 to the DR3 data, we find that, unsurprisingly, the DR3 data have shrunk to lower velocities. It's much easier to err on the side of finding a high velocity with Gaia. And so what we're finding here is that the median velocity for the entire sample has gone from 39 kilometers per second in DR2 to 30 kilometers per second in DR3. And that's a significant shift. So some of our findings in the 2020 paper, where we had suggested that the stars seem to be moving too fast, indeed, now we can see that the velocities were, the measurements themselves were biased toward high values. So here are velocity distributions of the subsamples. So again, these are still preliminary values, but the total distribution is shown in the dark blue histogram up here. When we look at only the OBe stars, we see the green distribution. When we look at the rest of the stars, we see the brown distribution, which are the normal OB stars. And then we've also broken out some of these other populations, the high mass X-ray binaries, the double line spectroscopic binaries, and the eclipsing binaries in these populations, which are way down here. And these are blown up, they're zoomed on the right-hand side. So if you believe that the OBe stars are indeed ejected by supernova mechanism, having originated from as binary stars, then you would expect them, as mentioned, to be somewhat slower in their distribution than the normal OB stars, which are presumably ejected by the dynamical mechanism. And indeed, we see that the green distribution, the OBe stars, do show a slower velocity distribution than we see for the brown, which is everything else. So the values for the medians are given down here. OBe stars are 25 kilometers per second compared to the OB stars, which are 37 kilometers per second. Looking at these populations on the right, these are, as mentioned, zoomed in from what you see down at the bottom here. And these are tracer populations of the two different mechanisms. Recall that eclipsing binaries and double-line spectroscopic binaries are non-compact binary systems. These are field stars, so they must have been ejected into the field, and therefore they must be tracers of the dynamical ejection mechanism. They can't have been ejected as binary systems by the supernova mechanism. So they would really trace what the dynamical ejection distribution should look like. The high mass X-ray binaries, as we've talked about before, are definitely tracers of the post-supernova binary objects. So when we look at the differences between these, we see that the dynamical ejection mechanism tracers do go to very high velocity tails, as you see here, whereas the high mass X-ray binaries do not. They stay at lower velocities. And that's exactly what you see here between the OBe stars in green and the normal OB stars in brown. So indeed, the brown does seem to correspond to the tracer objects for the dynamical, and the OBEs seem to correspond to the tracer for the supernova mechanisms. And again, the median values are shown down here. We can look at the masses of these objects as well. So looking at the distribution in mass and velocity now, the dynamical objects, which we believe are on the left-hand side, and we expect these to be faster, more massive stars. We can see that indeed they move toward higher values on both of these axes when compared to the OBe stars, which we expect to be somewhat slower, lower mass stars if they are the product of the supernova ejection mechanism. The tracer populations are plotted on top of these as well. So eclipsing binaries and double-line spectroscopic binaries. And on the right-hand side, the high mass X-ray binaries. So you can see that the tracer populations, again, match what we're looking at for these two different scenarios. Now, for the OBe stars, which we think are supernova ejected objects, they should be hugging this lower left corner, but we do also see a lot of them that seem to be way out here, which is contrary to the expectations for the supernova mechanism. So what's going on there? Well, first of all, they could be in error, as we found out the hard way by trusting the DR2 data too much. So that is a possibility. But there's also the two-step ejection mechanism to consider. That's when we have the non-compact binaries that are ejected, and we know they exist. We just saw a whole bunch of them. So we know these non-compact binaries get ejected dynamically into the field, and they must be tight binaries because they were ejected. Therefore, as tight binaries, they must undergo mass transfer and likely become OBe stars. And therefore, as typical OBe stars, eventually the mass donor will go supernova and re-accelerate the remaining star, which is the mass gainer, and which is now seen as a fast supernova accelerated object. It's extra fast because it was originally ejected as a dynamical ejected object. So these would be very fast OBe stars and could explain why we're seeing a whole bunch of objects out here. Indeed, we expect a whole lot of these to exist precisely because we do know that there are a lot of these non-compact binaries that get ejected. So we can quantify these these comparisons by looking at observed quantities and modeled quantities. So for the models, we are taking the work of O and Krupa, looking at dynamical ejections from clusters and adopting some parameters that are consistent with their models. And then for the supernova ejections, we can look at the binary population synthesis models of Renzo et al. For supernova ejections and assume that, say, half of them are ejected and unbound from their parent clusters. So if we combine these two, then we can start generating some numbers to compare to our total observations. We can compare, for example, for runaway stars, which are defined to be greater than 30 kilometers per second, we can look at the ratio of dynamical to supernova objects that we observe. We could also look at the ratio of walkaway to runaway objects. And walkaway objects I'm defining as objects unbound from their clusters, but which are slower than the 30 kilometer per second threshold for runaways. We can look at the sub-distributions of walkaways to runaways expected from the supernova mechanism and from the dynamical mechanism. So these are the numbers that we get from our observations. Again, these are preliminary numbers. They do include a significant correction factor of 2.4 for the walkaway objects that were not observed in our sample, because our sample looks at very deep field objects, and one can imagine there are a lot of walkaway objects that are still too close to their clusters to make it into our sample. So with those kinds of large correction factors, these are the numbers that we get. And you can actually see that they're surprisingly similar, actually, to what we can get from the models. There are a lot of parameters that can be adjusted, for example, but the fact that these numbers are already so similar is interesting and lends confidence to this whole scenario. Indeed, one wouldn't even expect them to be that similar because these models all assume single populations where all the stars are created at once. And in fact, we know that the SMC consists of a whole bunch of clusters that have contributed to this population with different ages. Okay, so for the classical OBe stars back in 2016, when we discovered so many of them and such early types in the SMC, we attributed it to the low metallicity, saying, okay, we have weak stellar winds, and therefore the stars retain angular momentum, allowing them to spin faster, and therefore enhancing the likelihood of disk formation. That is certainly true, but it's not the main, the driving force here behind the population. I now believe that this is simply because we're looking at a more prevalent binary population at low metallicity. We know that at low metallicity, this has all been summarized beautifully by Renzo in 2019 and other work, that at low metallicity, there's a high binary frequency, that you have more massive binaries, and also that you get later and therefore faster mass transfer happening, and that this also results in tighter binaries and fewer unbound ones. So all of this really contributes to the population of the OBE stars and dominates these effects. All right, so I want to end by showing you a particularly interesting example here for the aficionados of the OE stars. So this is AZV493, one of our field stars that we have in our sample, which has shown remarkable variability. And over the years, we have obtained a quite extensive set of data about this object. So here we have 11 different spectra obtained, and you can see already there's a lot of variation in these. This is one of our earliest, if not the earliest, OE star in our sample, and perhaps even known. You can see that the helium-2 lines in absorption are the only constant feature throughout all of these spectra. Everything else seems to vary. We've done spectral modeling of this star, yielding an effective temperature of 42,000 degrees. And it's a star that is about 50 solar masses. And you can see a lot of variation in these spectra. But it's not just the spectra that vary. Here is the light curve of the star. Of course, all OBE stars are slightly variable, but this one really shows a very strong magnitude variation. This is I band, and the maximum up here to down here is about 1.2 magnitudes in I. And this is a time scale of, well, from 2002 to 2022 over here. The long-term period from here to here is 14 years, 14 and a half years. And you can see that we have this strong peak dropping to a very low magnitude and then gradually increasing over a couple years here. And then you can see small scale variations also happening here, some kind of eruption activity, which seems to take place. This point is exactly at the midpoint of the cycle if you start the cycle here. And then we also see larger variations of a few tenths of a magnitude, again, with multiple cycles, as you can see, multiple time scales in these different sub-periods. The vertical lines indicate where we've obtained the spectroscopic data. The V-band points are shown in red, so you can also get V minus I for some of these. Now, when we look at this variation in this region here, we can see that it's actually a semi-regular pulsation that you can see, again, also reflected in the V minus I values. And this period is very hard to explain. It's not inconsistent with a stellar pulsation, but the origin of such a stellar pulsation would be hard to explain and unknown. It could also be due to the disk, but again, if this was a disk pulsation, if the whole system was induced by an eccentric binary, which is what we believe, then getting such short period disk pulsations is very hard to do. Once again, this is the color magnitude diagram. And the whole sample is shown here in the gray points. The OBE stars are shown with the circled gray points. So you can see that the object, which is shown in the colored points, is very much in the regime of the OBE stars, in fact, spanning it with its variations. If we zoom in on it here, we get this plot, and this is the beginning. This is days. So it starts 14 years ago here, and then starts moving here, and then goes back and forth with these short-term pulsations. Again, I kind of think it's consistent with a stellar pulsation because it's blue and faint and then goes to large and red, but disk variations can also explain this, and all of you are much more expert. So I would be very interested in discussing this with anyone. So back to the light curve, we have this strong drop in magnitude that gradually increases. We see it again over here 14 years later. And in fact, if you take these points and shift them back to here and overplot them as these gray points, you can see that it matches exactly. The fact that it matches so perfectly strongly suggests a geometric kind of effect. And so I'm thinking really in the first instance that this is an obscuration and that the disk is gradually dissipating. So for example, if we look at this kind of model where we have the star, the line of sight, and that we have an optically thick disk with a flare, perhaps even some kind of torus surrounding the star that gradually dissipates, then we could potentially explain the gradual brightening that we see. And if this happens regularly, then that obscuration should match pretty much exactly, since it's a geometric effect. The amount of extinction that is seen corresponds to about 50% of the starlight being obscured, which would imply an angle of inclination about 45 degrees. On the other hand, it's also been suggested that this increase in magnitude that you see here is not due to the star being obscured and then becoming unobscured, but rather that this is a contribution of light from the disk itself. So that means the disk would have to be completely destroyed at this point and would then instead grow. So then you would start with something like this, where we can see the whole system and the disk starts growing and it gets bigger, and therefore the light from the whole system increases. So it's not clear which of these scenarios is correct. Again, this whole system certainly bears further inspection. But one thing is that we do have a pretty good idea that there is a flare in the disk, at least at some points. So if you look at spectrum A here, this was actually the first one that we happened to have obtained, but you see that the peak separation in the Balmer lines is larger than the peak separation that you see in the helium-1 lines and the helium-2 line, which is actually an emission here as well. So that suggests that the highly ionized region, the hottest regions, are farther out in the disk, if you're assuming a Keplerian rotation, than what we see for the dominant emission. Again, strongly suggesting that there is some kind of flared scenario, and this similar objects have been modeled by Seagut et al. Showing that kind of behavior in the excitation. On the other hand, you also see the opposite. So going to the last spectrum we obtained, spectrum K, we indeed see that the Balmer line peak separation is closer, smaller than what you see in the helium-1 lines. So there we see that the high ionization species are dominated by the inner disk rather than by the outer disk. So there's a lot of change happening in this disk, and other very interesting things that we also see. For example, in spectrum B, we see evidence of P Cygni outflow from this object. Spectrum F is also remarkable, where we see the opposite. We instead see inverse P Cygni, and I can show you a zoom in on that. Inverse P Cygni, which is evidence of infall. So here's the inverse P Cygni trough here, and it goes below the continuum in helium-1. And when one looks at the kinematics implied by that trough, it's fully consistent with free fall into the star from dense blobs. I'm saying dense blobs because when you look at these spectra, you can see, these Balmer line peaks, which don't follow a decrement, implying that the object is very optically thick, explaining why these peaks are so bright, also very high surface brightness. And so something very interesting is happening in spectrum F there. So a lot of variations in the disk happening. Of course, this object is also a runaway star. And so here are the Gaia velocities for this object. There are two possible values. One of them is 53 kilometers per second in a direction diametrically opposed to the nearest star forming region here. And then the other value is a very slow value of 16 kilometers per second coming from a region where there's nothing. So as mentioned, it's highly unlikely that the object formed as an isolated object in the middle of nowhere. Therefore, it's most likely a fast runaway from the nearest star-forming region. It's still quite far, about 300 parsecs away, which would imply a 5 million year travel time if this number is correct, which again, it may or may not be. But 5 million years is a long time to be post-supernova. And so it's suggesting this object is probably a two-step ejection, taking all of this at face value. So it may have been ejected as a two-stepper from this region and very recently changed its velocity slightly, but still happening to be in the same direction more or less, which again is also a bit suspicious. But in any case, this is also consistent with the idea that it originated as a supernova object. And most likely, the whole thing is an eccentric binary. To explain the strange light curve and the strange 14-year cycle, it being 14 years suggests a highly eccentric orbit, which is consistent also with it being a post-supernova object. So we think this is one of the earliest OE stars known, 50 solar masses, and it's likely an eccentric binary. The period is 14.6 years, or if you go with the half period, 7.3 years, they're both very eccentric. We see a lot of spectral variation in this object, including evidence of infall in one of the episodes, and it is a runaway. So this object is super interesting. I hope somebody decides to follow it up, and I can't think of a better audience in which to advertise that. So to summarize, we've looked at the OBE stars as post-interaction binaries. The evidence does seem to support this. Most of them appear to be post-supernova objects, as evidenced in our work from the fact that they are mostly field stars. The proper motion kinematics support this. They track the high-mass X-ray binaries. We see evidence that at least one of them is extremely eccentric, and we would expect many more of them also to be. And having looked at this very low metallicity system where we expect more binaries and tighter binaries, we also see that there are more OBE stars and earlier OE stars. So the picture all seems to hang together beautifully. This has consequences for massive star evolution, the origin of transients and multi-messenger phenomena, and Lyman continuum production. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Sally, on behalf of everyone. All right, so I guess we'll open it up to questions. So does anyone have a question for Sally? Norbert?
Didn't want to be the first one to ask, but okay. First of all, Sally, congratulations to this great work. I think it's a huge collection of data you have assembled over the last years, and helps us a lot to understand the population of massive stars in the SMC and therefore in the universe. So it's really a great effort.
Thank you so much.
I have a short comment and then perhaps a question. My comment is that on your conclusions, you dwell pretty much on theoretical assumptions. For example, what do you expect for runaway velocities from the binary supernova scenario? You essentially use Mathieu-Renzo's predictions there, which, if I exaggerate a little bit, say there is basically no fast runaways from supernova ejections. But that depends very much on what is used as binary physics in the binary evolution. So, when I look at our binary grids, we take your data and we derive the opposite conclusion. We see a lot of fast runaways from supernovae. We predict much tighter binary systems pre-supernovae. And so there's, I think, still room for, other interpretations as well. But I have a question which concerns the runaway character of the BE stars. So if we go towards the lower mass range of them, we expect also white dwarfs to come out of the strip star. So we don't have any kick, any runaway effect there. And so I'm wondering, so I think I would expect that coming in below, say, 15 solar masses or so. Is that something you can test, which you could see, or is this out of reach in the essence?
Thank you so much, Norbert, and thank you for stressing the uncertainty of the theoretical models. You're absolutely right, of course, and you and your group have been at the forefront of all of this. Yes, I think it is testable, but in our sample, we don't go that low in mass. So I would not expect to see in our sample that we have evidence of those, at least not very much evidence of those objects that do not have supernova companions. But I hope that, you know, with deeper data, it will become possible to do that. And it may be possible to do this in the Milky Way, for example. So that's a wonderful point, and it would be a great thing to look for. And yeah, I think if we have additional predictions for the different scenarios and start being able also to combine, in particular, the which objects are ejected from clusters and which ones are not, together with the binary population synthesis models, that will be a huge step toward really making more accurate comparisons between the observations and the models.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, next up we have Dietrich.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I would like to second Norbert's comments on your work in general and your presentation, very clear. So congratulations and thank you for that. I have three comments. One concerns the 30 to 40 day pulsations that you have found. And one possible explanation for this is that these are not single mode pulsations, but that these pulsation periods are beat periods of multiple pulsations. And the photometric variability is not due to the pulsation, but to mass ejections, which are coupled to the beating of the frequencies. And the beating is amplified by the fact that in these stars, one has very many combination frequencies. So it's not so that just two modes are coupled, but many. And you have a beating not of two modes, but of many. So that could amplify the effect. I think that's a very valid hypothesis for the explanation. The second comment concerns the earliest spectral type that one finds for OB stars in the Magellanic Clouds and in the Milky Way. It suggests that in the Milky Way, where the metallicity is lower, the winds are weaker, which you have said, and therefore the winds have a less detrimental effect on the disks. So the disk can survive until earlier spectral types than in the Milky Way. And that would suggest that this whole phenomenon extends to much higher temperatures than just the presence of the BE or OE typical emission lines, which I think is an important thing to follow up on. And then the third point concerns observations that I did 30 years ago in a technical half night. And I did slitless spectroscopy of, I think, 5 or 6 young open clusters in the LMC. And I was very surprised. I've never seen anything nearly as surprising as this, and I never had time to follow up on this. One could clearly see the clusters as a concentration of stars, as you would expect in a cluster. But when you then look at the BE stars, the emission line objects, in a field with a field of view of 7 by 7 arc minutes, so that's more than 100 parsecs, it was sometimes impossible to see any clustering of the BE stars. So they were spread all over the field. And I'm wondering whether you have seen anything similar in your data.
Well, thank you for all of these points. yeah, with regard to the beats that you mentioned, I hope that you or someone would be able to follow up on that very interesting explanation. That sounds very promising. With regard to the disk survival, I'm glad that you mentioned that, because that is one thing that I was quite, I don't know whether surprise is the right word, because I'm not an expert on these things, but one conclusion that one draws from this is that the disks are very long-lived. They have very long lives, because we see that so many of the OE stars, OBE stars still exist, and that their numbers seem to be consistent with what one might expect, and therefore the disks must be very long-lived. And if that is a function of metallicity itself, then that would be a wonderful explanation, and one could potentially test that somehow. And so your final question was about the clustering of OBE stars. So I guess the clustering study that we did was the first one, where we specifically looked at the distances of OE stars and BE stars from the nearest clusters. So effectively, I would say that that is what the work that we did that is consistent with what your observation is, although it's not something where we visually look to see. We did not look at individual clusters to observe the effect that you found, but it is consistent with what you found. And I guess it depends on the age of the cluster also, right? So whether one sees a clear separation of the OBE stars or not depends on the age of the cluster. To some extent, I guess, would be my comment. That would be an interesting thing just to look at visually. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your answers.
Okay, and there's one more hand up. Sally, if we have time for one more question.
Sure.
So go ahead.
Ben?
Okay, so it doesn't seem like we can hear you, Ben, but I guess in the meantime, another hand was raised, Yael. So sorry, Ben, if you want to write your question in the chat maybe, but yeah, I'll go ahead.
Right, it's a very quick question, Sally. Towards the end, when you mentioned that weird object, you mentioned that it could be eccentric. Then you provide a very specific value for the eccentricity. How do you derive the eccentricities? And
yeah,
radial velocity measurements, or
it's from the orbital period combined with an assumption that the periastron is something like I can't remember, 40 stellar radii or something like that. We took a number that was, I think, from delta SCO or something. It was just a ballpark figure.
Okay, so I mean, do you have any reasons why it would be like delta SCO?
No, except that delta SCO is an OE star, and it should, if it's going to be inducing activity that's observable, like, disk variations and all that kind of thing, then it should not be farther than some value. And so delta SCO just seemed like a good one. So the answer is no, it's just a kind of random value. But in any case, it's certainly eccentric. It might not be 0.93, but it might be 0.9, or it might be, one can play around with the value.
Okay.
Okay, and Ben,
I think we have the question from Ben.
That's right. So maybe I'll read it for everyone. So I guess the audio doesn't work. Thanks for the informative talk. I wanted to ask about the non-EOB stars that are fast rotators. Can you conclude that they are also post-interaction products from their relative positions on the sky space velocities?
We have not looked at their positions on the sky separately, and it's worth doing because my student just yesterday, Grant Phillips, who is leading this work, just yesterday plotted up what their velocity distribution was as compared to the normal OB stars that were not fast rotators, and actually discovered that their velocity distributions was more similar to the normal OB stars that were not fast rotators rather than the OBE stars, which was a bit of a surprise to me. So yeah, we still don't know exactly what those objects are. I would have thought that they would be similar to the OBE stars, but they may or may not be. So the nature of these objects remains to be determined. Yeah, thanks for asking about those.
All right. Well, let's all thank Dr. Sally Uwe once more for this very nice talk. And we will all be convening once again next month for a talk whose details will be conveyed to you as soon as possible. So thank you again, Sally. And everyone have a good rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Sally.
Thanks a lot.